This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Nichole Graber-Simmons manages the Office of Citizen Security as a Foreign Service Officer for USAID in Jamaica, covering programs for at-risk youth, community safety and security, anti-corruption, human rights, and education. Prior to Jamaica, Nichole worked in Haiti for 2 years as a democracy and governance officer, where she managed a reintegration program of Haitian deportees. She has also worked with USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives as a program manager on their Pakistan and Uganda programs, and served as OTI's acting deputy country representative in Zimbabwe. Prior to joining USAID, Nichole worked with the American Red Cross, UNDP, and Habitat for Humanity as an AmeriCorps volunteer. Nichole has a Master's in International Development from Melbourne, Australia as a Rotary Scholar, a Graduate Diploma from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and a BA from Point Loma Nazarene University. I spoke with Nichole in Kingston, Jamaica. Hi, Nichole. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. It's nice to be here.
Where are we calling you today?
I am sitting in Kingston, Jamaica.
That's fantastic. How's the weather in Kingston?
Well, it's pretty hot, even though it's about 8:30 p.m. But we're in a bit of a drought crisis, so that's made it a lot hotter.
Well, maybe we can talk about that. Tell us, why are you in Jamaica? What is it that you do right now? What's your title and some of the work that you do?
Okay. I work for the United States International Agency for Development, or known as USAID. I'm actually the office director of the Office of Citizen Security, which in layman development terms is the Democracy and Governance Office. But because the reason USAID is really heavy in Jamaica is all the crime and violence, so most of our programming deals with citizen security programs. That's, community-based policing, at-risk youth, building safer communities. We do some human rights programming, and I also have education in my office. So that's literacy grades 1 through 3. So I basically run the office. I have about 5 or 6 staff, around 10 programs that we're managing at any given time. I personally manage a literacy program in about 100 poor performing schools. And I also manage a program working in one of the juvenile prisons with female juvenile prisoners who are trying to get out and trying to get trials, or trying to go on trial and not get sentenced. So that's mainly my focus.
And my first question, that you've combined security and education. Is there a purpose behind that? Is there a connection between those two types of programs, or is that just a bureaucratic happenstance?
Yes and yes. Some of it is just the way our director had reorganized the mission and the offices before I got here. Because Jamaica is a fairly small mission as far as USAID goes. I'm coming from Haiti, which was roughly 5 times as big as far as staff and money. Jamaica is really told to narrow focus. So they focus on health, environment, citizen security, and education. So it's partly how the offices are organized. But also when you think about it, really a lot of what turns young adolescents to crime is dropping out of school. So when we focus on the early grades, when they start dropping out around grade 6, that's, if you can keep kids in school, you find a lot of them tend to go on and get better educations and jobs and not turn to a life of crime. So there is a connection there as well.
And you mentioned that you've got staff, and I assume they're focusing on, these 10 projects that you're working on. Is there a reason why you decided to also manage a project? And if so, why did you choose the education side instead of the security side? I
started my career as a teacher, basically. Funny, because I kind of followed my sister's footsteps. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica, and so I had gone down to visit her and really loved the country, and so I decided to stay one of the trips and became a teacher there. So I do have an education background in that sense, but that teaching kind of launched me into international development, and that's what I got my master's into. So it's kind of a secondary part for me. I basically showed up my very first day of work and was told, you're going to manage this education program. So that wasn't really a choice. But because we're such a small mission, typically you would not have office directors managing programs. They would more manage staff and manage the general vision and strategy. But because we're so small, we actually only have 4 Americans in our mission, 5 Americans. So almost everyone is kind of managing programs as well. And personally, it's my choice because that's the work I really enjoy. I really like getting in the technical side of development and managing programs. So I've kind of taken on extra work so that I can manage more as opposed to only supervise.
Take me back to that story about Costa Rica. We're always interested in, how did you get to where you are today? Has development and aid always been your chosen career path, or did you think sometime you wanted to be in business or follow a different career path?
Right out of college, I went into AmeriCorps. So I started volunteering already in the inner cities. I was working for a homeless program in San Francisco, working also for Habitat for Humanity. So I started kind of getting that feel of the nonprofit world and working with poor communities, and I really liked it, but was missing that international piece. So like I said, right after AmeriCorps, my sister was in the Peace Corps. I went and followed her to Costa Rica, ended up staying. And from there, I was done. I was just completely sold on the international lifestyle. I went from that to living a bit in Europe so I could learn French and Spanish, and complete my Spanish. Those seemed to be really desirable languages. Then moved on to the Dominican Republic, worked for an NGO there. I kind of plateaued at that point, realizing I really needed a master's degree. So I went back to the U.S. I worked for an international NGO that worked out of San Francisco. They were working mainly in Russia. It was State Department funded, working with Rotary clubs, sending Russian groups to the U.S. to learn kind of business practices. And from there, I got into a really good master's program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And everyone had said the good jobs are in D.C. So I went back to D.C. And that was kind of a pretty scary time, because you come back, the competition's steep, everybody has years of experience, everyone has a master's degrees. I was really struggling. I floundered for about a year. And I got some really good advice from someone who actually works for the International Office for Migration, which is where my sister ended up. And she basically told me to go and try and temp in the companies that like the World Bank and the Red Cross, the big development agencies hire, and get your foot in the door. And so that's what I started doing. And I ended up getting a 6-month contract with the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, working on disaster preparedness. And from there, kind of worked my way into knowing some contacts with USAID. And after about a year and a half in D.C., I landed my dream job, which was the Office of Transition Initiatives, which was USAID.
Why was that your dream job?
So OTI is kind of a specialty shop in USAID, and they tend to go in after conflicts in countries. They're very fast and flexible. They're not very bureaucratic. They do really cool work. It's very passionate people, young, very intelligent. I had found out about them again. My sister had done some work with them in Afghanistan.
Can you give me an example? Like when you say really cool work, and obviously everybody thinks the work that they do is the coolest. What does that mean to you? Is it you go in and you're standing up schools? Is it you're working with government counterparts? What's really cool work at OTI?
It's really all of that, because it's not so much the work they're doing, it's that they're building peace. So when a conflict ends and before big aid, as we say, the long-term development gets in, OTI is kind of holding that bridge. They're kind of holding that peace and that transition together until a big aid and development can take place. So whatever that means, whether it is building schools to show the government is responding after a conflict, or, if there's an open space for democracy, suddenly maybe supporting an opposition party that can take place that really promotes peace and the people's choice. So they're very political, but what they're doing in each country shows up very differently.
So can you give me a specific example, like,
Sure.
One of the countries maybe you visited and the type of initiative that you were working on or helping support?
Sure. A lot of the work's very sensitive, so I'll try and stay away from those projects.
Sure.
But I did work in Pakistan and FATA in the federally administrative tribal regions, and I worked in Zimbabwe, which is also a very sensitive area. But one of the most rewarding projects where I could actually go out and see things, because it was less politically sensitive, was in northern Uganda. The 30-some year civil war had ended with the Lord's Resistance Army, And the government there really wanted to show they were responding to the people. And one of OTI's jobs was to clear the camps. So people had been living in internally displaced camps for literally decades, and they were very afraid to return home. So OTI was building schools. They were building government offices so that the local representatives was there in the community, and the community members knew where to find them. They were clearing the camps, finding people alternate settlements, and then literally, raising the huts and those that had been there for decades. Somewhat symbolically, to show we're shutting down this phase and peace is coming in. So I had worked on that program from DC, but also went out to northern Uganda and worked on some of those initiatives as well. OTI can be very competitive. It's very hard to get an international job. And so I was realizing that I probably needed a few more years in the field before I could move into one of their positions. So around the time USAID had the Foreign Service, which really mimics State Department's Foreign Service, had a hiring freeze in the 90s. And so they kind of were opening it up, and they were planning to hire about 1,000 new junior officers. And I jumped on that bandwagon and interviewed and got hired as technically what was called a crisis stabilization and governance officer, which is a long title for a democracy and governance officer. And so after 2 years with OTI, I just kind of transitioned into that role, still with USAID, and next thing I knew, I was in Haiti.
And what were you doing in Haiti? Was it the similar democracy and governance work as well?
Yeah, that was very typical DG work. It was a year after the earthquake, and I had really wanted to go. I mean, once the earthquake hit, and that was a very different kind of transition. You had a natural disaster. There was a new prime minister coming in. A lot of work that needed to be done, millions and millions of dollars, very high priority, high profile. And so I went in to work on the DG team literally a month before the election. So one of my first tasks was working on the elections and being one of the neutral observers there. And from that, I went on to manage a program dealing with some of the deportees and reintegrating them into Haitian society. We had a very large parliamentary program that we worked there. We geared up for local elections as well. We had a local governance program that worked in a lot of the communities. So it was a really massive program. So a lot of really good traditional development, democracy and governance experience for me. Mm-hmm. And I just over 2 years there. And
then was your tour 2 years, or did you I'm not sure exactly what the specific time lengths are with aid. Did you transition as part of your career specifically, or did you seek out Jamaica?
Yeah, so typically the USAID Foreign Service works very much like state. We have 2 to 4 year posts. Haiti is a 2-year post because it's more of a hardship post. And so after our time, then we actually bid on any position that's within our rank and pretty much worldwide. So I was looking at some of the options and had really liked working in the Caribbean, being close to home. I was looking at the Latin American Caribbean region, and this position in Jamaica became available. And so I bid at number 1. And for me, it was a huge step up because I was basically managing the DG office. And so I ended up getting it, which was very cool. Mm-hmm. And that was just over a year ago. So I've been here a year, and this is actually a 4-year post. So I'll be here a total of 4 years.
You've had a fantastic arc of experience in the development world. Can you tell me maybe some of the starkest differences between, for instance, you said you were working at the Red Cross, you were working at an NGO in the DR, you've done some volunteer work in other places, and now you're sort of at one of the what many people would call, sort of the pinnacle, the holy grail of working for aid or one of these positions. What are some of the starkest differences between, maybe working in an NGO and working for the government, the U.S. government in this case, that you've found in your career so far?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things I miss, I can tell you, which is a big difference, is working more closer on the ground with the beneficiaries. NGOs and even USAID implementers that are for-profits, they're really we're basically funding them to implement the project. So USAID has, over the years, taken themselves out of the implementation business and is more in the business of managing implementers. So I manage contracts and agreements and I manage implementers, but I'm one step removed. That, for me, that's kind of a downside because it can be a very bureaucratic business and you do more office work as opposed to working with the beneficiaries. And when I worked for NGOs, I was right on the ground. I was every day out in the field. So that's one of the big differences. And I really miss that work. I mean, in a way, it's the pinnacle because you get to manage a lot of money and you get to make big policy decisions on how that money will be spent and work with government counterparts and, ensure that you're really keeping their priorities in mind. But you're not so much on the ground. You're removed from the beneficiaries. And that's what I really miss.
What about some of the tools and resources that maybe you have available to you? Do you feel now that you're working at AID that you sort of have all of the greatest and latest, technology and systems and whatnot at your disposal to make things work? And maybe it was different in your NGO experience or vice versa?
Yeah, I would say, AID is very well resourced and they really put a lot, and I think that's partly because it's the Foreign Service. So we're career diplomats in a way. So they invest a lot in our training, updating our training. So, we have the latest certificates and really know about contract management and so forth, that maybe you don't get as much as with an NGO because you're more temporary. They do invest, I would say our administrator currently invests a lot in science and technology and innovation. That is a huge push for him and a huge focus. And so we've brought in a lot of private sector people and we're working with a lot of private sector companies now that are bringing in more and more innovative toolkits, as you say, and resources and research. And I have to say USAID does a really good job about doing the background and bringing in consultants and doing the research before they even start designing a program. So they really take all the stakeholders' consultations and interests in mind. And they take a long time. That's part of the bureaucracy of it, but they do take sometimes a year to design a program to make sure they get it right. There's also a lot more focus now on monitoring and evaluation. Impact evaluations are the biggest thing right now, where you have a control and focus group and you really start at the beginning of the project and you monitor it and evaluate it the whole way through so that partway you can start making changes if things aren't working. Those are all very new things to AID, and that's kind of, where you get that you have a lot of resources to play with so that you have innovation and new tools and new resources always coming in.
What about, I'm glad that you touched on how you're measuring the success of programs. Are there, again, sort of specific technologies that you're using in order to do M&E? Is it still sort of Excel spreadsheet based? Is it, customized databases? How are you collecting data in the field? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I'm not an M&E expert, so a lot of that we even farm out. We even put out requests for contracts and contract out some of our big evaluations, and we do our ongoing monitoring, but the big thing now is performance and impact evaluations, and a lot of that we hire very technical, specialized firms and consultants that know how to do that. That's what they do. That's their expertise. So they still use a lot of data, a lot of spreadsheets. They're using raw data. They're using, in the DG world, a lot of it's public perception-based surveys. We carry out one every other year, so we have kind of longitude data on a wide swath of topics that cover all of our programs. And then we do more specific, whether it's performance or impact evaluations on those exact programs. So I wouldn't even know how to begin with all the technical software they're using to collect data and surveys and so forth, because a lot of that's farmed out. But they're doing it, and that's what's important. Especially this administrator is taking has a huge focus and is really emphasizing doing heavy monitoring evaluations, and not just on standard indicators, but are we really getting the results we want to, and what's really working and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that now you're one step removed from the programs that are on the ground. Because you've seen it from both sides, both sides of the coin, what are some of the positives that you have seen from working with NGOs now and implementers? And what are some of the negatives that now that you're on the other side? Let me expand that thought a little bit more, in that I think many of the people in the audience are aware of frustrations with a donor, and frustrations with implementing a project for a donor and some of the bureaucratic hurdles you've got to run through and those kinds of things. But we don't often hear the other side of the coin of frustrations with the implementers and frustrations, well, why can't they do this? Are there both successes and challenges that you could tell us about from that side?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm in a very good position, and that's because USAID, in many ways, because we control the purse strings, we also control how programs will go, and particularly when we're working with for-profit companies and we have contracts with them, especially the international ones, we really have a lot of say. I mean, they have to come to us for almost any approval. And so we have a lot of leeway in how we can guide the program. I would still say their work may be more fun because they're, again, on the ground, but really they have to come to us with a lot of it. And we also have the fun side of designing programs, designing policy, designing like the big picture strategy. We just finished in Jamaica just a year ago, our 5-year strategy. And so, you get to really say, well, what's our development goal and where do we want to go with this, and meet with all the stakeholders. And there's a lot of, interesting things that come from being at that high level where you're getting access to sometimes prime ministers or ministers at a very high level to find out, well, what does this country really want to do? Mm-hmm. Like, where do they want to go? And what's their vision for the next 5-10 years? And at the NGO level, you wouldn't get that. They're very different worlds. I mean, it just depends what people like. Some people like to be on the ground. Other people like to be at more of a high policy level. I guess I like a combination of both. So I miss the on the ground stuff, but it's also nice to not have to worry about, well, where are we going to get money next, and writing all those proposals. And there's a certain amount of job security in this business, which doesn't have a lot of job security, in working for, the U.S. government, not just in job security, but also I've worked in some pretty dicey countries. I was in Fiji with the UNDP, actually, when there was a coup, their 4th coup. And we knew we were very well protected. We knew if we had to evacuate that the UN would take care of us. It's the same thing with U.S. government. You know you're going to be protected, and that gives you a sense of security in working in some pretty insecure countries. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if NGOs always have that same kind of protection and resources.
In a brief sense, you talked about you just finished your 5-year strategy, and we'll assume that as you said, you work with stakeholders to sort of identify those needs and then build that strategy out from there. How do you design a program from there? Is there a brief explanation you could give to us about how that mechanism works within your office?
Oh, not brief at all. It's very long and bureaucratic. Even designing the strategy takes, probably a 5-year strategy might take a year or less. But from that, so the strategy kind of encompasses the entire mission, and it really takes into account all the other U.S. government agencies you might be working with, from State Department to Narcotics Affairs to the political section. From that, then we design what's called project appraisal documents, PADs, and those are the strategies for the particular office. So my office in particular would design one over the next 5 years just for citizen security. Once you have that in place, then you get to start designing your activities, which are the agreements you have with a particular implementer to do XYZ in a school, or another one to work on a human rights campaign. So it breaks it down to levels, and you basically have your development objective, which is the high-level goal for the mission, and then you go down into the intermediate results from there. So it's a very long process. Now, not to say that work stops during any of that. You can be implementing programs and you can be or activities as we now call them, the smaller level implementation mechanisms while you're designing the big level strategy, because you'll have the old strategy still in place and you're going to have ongoing activities that are running throughout. So it's not that the work ever stops.
Many times people that we're interviewing here on Terms of Reference is they're either independent professionals or leaders of NGOs or organizations. And one of the typical questions I would ask is, how do you raise funds? What are your strategies? Where do you find it? You don't necessarily have that problem. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, how does that work for your mission? You have a budget that you're allocated from the U.S. government in some way. Is there ever a fear that, oh gosh, our budget's going to get cut in half next year? There's always that talk, at least I know from the U.S. government side of, some political party says, hey, we've got to stop this foreign aid kind of thing. Take me through that. Or are there actual feels around that, or how does that work?
Yeah, people think, well, you work for USAID, you have all the resources, so you don't have to scramble for funds or apply, and it's actually not the case at all. In a big mission like Haiti, yeah, it's true. We had more money, especially after the earthquake, than we knew what to do with. So we wouldn't ever have applied for extra funding. But in a smaller mission like Jamaica, you have a very different situation. You're basically allocated a certain amount of funding. And a few years ago, our USAID core funding was actually zeroed out for democracy and governance. So what we receive now is called Caribbean Basin Security Initiative funds. And those funds actually come from the State Department. And we get a pretty substantial amount to do enough every year. But to do more that we want to do, because those funds are a bit restricted, we actually apply to different pools from DC. So if we want to do a human rights program, we will actually send in a concept note and an application to apply for human rights funding. If we were funding elections, for example, we would apply for electoral assistance as well. We don't actually fund elections in Jamaica, but that would be another example.
So the competitive pool would be other missions in just your region or globally?
So some of those are globally. Most of them are globally. Some of them will just be regional. And some missions, absolutely their mission director and their office directors have to make a very good case on why they should keep their funding, because a lot of these decisions are made at the DC level. Congress reviews our budget every year, the Office of Budget Management. And so some missions will find themselves in a place where as you said, their budgets will literally be slashed in half for policy regions or priority reasons. And they have to make a very, very good case. I think Jamaica has done a very good job in last year of putting itself on the map and making a very good case of why they need funding. And a lot of it comes down to results. Like, we are seeing results from a lot of our programming that speak to how we're using resources and how well we are, and that we should get more funding for that. And we're spending the money too, so we don't have a big pipeline with money sitting around. So those are all very positive things that DC looks at and says, okay, yeah, we're going to up their funding a little this year, or if we apply to certain things that are exciting initiatives to DC, then they'll give us usually that money as well. But it's not as easy as we're just handed money every year. In some ways, we have to write proposals and concept notes, much like the NGO community does, or the implementers.
Very interesting. What's your take right now? Within the development community, we know that development is a long lens, right? Development takes time. It's slow change. Sometimes there's tipping points, but there's a lot of talk over the last 5 years or so, especially since the financial crisis, of value for money, of accountability. What's the sense within either your office or your perspective from your career about how that's playing out and how that's affected how what you demand from your implementing partners and what's demanded of you from the people who give you money?
If I understand the question correctly, there's a lot of it determines, it's a very political game, and a lot of it is who's in office at the time. There's been a lot of talk lately of, just in general in the U.S., of government spending out of control, big budgets, and the American people in general tend to think, why are we spending our money overseas when we don't even have enough for programs domestically? And it's a valid response. That said, I would say a lot of Americans probably think we're spending a lot more of our GDP internationally than we actually are. So if you would take a poll, they might say, yeah, we're probably spending 10, 20% or even 25% on development. And when you ask them what should it be, they say, well, maybe 10 or 5%. When in actuality, we're spending less than 1%. And what we get for that less than 1% overseas, the value of not just, promoting the U.S. government abroad, because we really brand things, and a lot of it is, this is from the American people and trying to build goodwill, but building up economies in other countries, building up democracies, building up human rights, trying to create freedom of media in certain spaces, a lot of that is creating a safer world in generally, globally, but also a safer world for the Americans. I think every dollar that USAID stretches, we get so much back for that. The problem is we don't always do a good job of selling it. And so we don't get the support at home. And that's where you're starting to see now more and more calls to cut budgets, not just for USAID, but State Department too, overseas. And it's a way to pitch it. We just need to do better PR. I'm not sure if that is kind of what you're getting at, but
sure. No, that was a great perspective. What about other governments? You're in a pool of embassies in Jamaica. I have no idea what other countries maintain missions there. Do you work with your with other counterparts, with other development agencies, GTZ, DFID, these kinds of things, to pool funds to make sure your strategies overlap or don't duplicate, those kinds of things?
Yes, definitely here. I mean, again, it's harder to do in places like Haiti where there's such an influx of money and you barely have time to design programs and get it out. But in a place like Jamaica where you have the time, you can sit down, you have limited resources, so you really want to make those count. We do so much. I could name off the 5 biggest development partners we have here, and we're sitting monthly at the table with them. I know exactly what they're doing in citizen security. We're leveraging their dollars when we can combine resources on certain programs. We're doing an anti-corruption program right now with DFID. The government counterparts are always at the table too. So we're seeing, how can we either give them direct assistance or technical assistance, and also make sure their priorities are in mind. But yeah, I've really been impressed with how much we coordinate with other donors. In fact, here we call them International Development Partners, because that phraseology seems to resonate more in this country. And they have a lot of resources to bring. So we're partnering, we're collaborating on programs that are similar, we're leveraging funds from each other. And not just them, but also the private sector. USAID has really done a good job in the last few years of partnering on public-private partnerships, Global Development Alliance, as they call GDAs, where you have a one-to-one match with a private company. And so we can put in $2 million, and they're putting in $2 million, and we're getting this really large program leveraging. That's actually one of the programs I manage is that. And so we do a really good job here of coordinating with all the other stakeholders and making sure we're not duplicating in many of the communities. This is a really small country, so you really got to make sure that, we're, in fact, our largest citizen security program, we looked at the communities that DFID and the Canadians and French were working in, and we chose alternate communities to do similar work, but just so that we wouldn't be duplicating any efforts.
When you've given us some great examples of not only your work, but how your office is collaborating with other offices, etc. Sort of a two-part question. Tell me a story from your entire career of, if we were sitting down and you and I were, having a glass of wine together, and you wanted to tell me that one story of some work that you were doing that was just super powerful for you, that was a huge success, what would that story be?
The one that was most exciting for me, I probably can't talk about. It was in Zimbabwe. It was very political.
Okay, so your second best story.
I probably should stay away from that one. I have to say, as frustrating as Haiti was, because it's one of the most corrupt countries, and it's one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, and you see a lot of just not getting work done with the government. I managed a White House initiative there, which was when we brought down deportees, and most of these were ex-cons, to the country. And
you brought them down from where? From the United States?
The U.S., yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So people who were convicts in the United States, they were deported and then they came back to Haiti.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it was in many ways a human rights program, because when the program began, and I was there at the inception, so I helped with the design and followed it through almost to the end, the situation was a bit dire, where they would bring these people down, and the government of Haiti would sometimes detain them for a certain amount of time till their families could come pick them up or someone could actually vouch for them. It was a national security risk for them. But the conditions, they just don't have the resources to help people being detained. They don't have food and water. And we really worked really hard, which was even separate from what the program was doing, which it was a reintegration program. So it was really getting these people on their feet into their own micro enterprises, because the unemployment rate there is very high, getting them into language skills if they needed that, getting them writing their own business plans, getting even basic literacy and basic living skills if they needed that, sometimes getting them into lodging, giving them food for the day. That was the basic program. But what we did, me and my both state and USAID colleagues beyond that, which was working with the government to really show them a model of human rights and respect, and saying these people come down and they've done their time and they're free. And so we need to treat them as any normal citizens. And that includes getting them ID cards when they land. And from where we came when we started the program, which had very little government support on both sides in many ways, to towards the end when I left, where the flights would come in, and we had the Office of National Migration from the U.S., from the government of Haiti there, collect their belongings. They had food provided the first day. They were filed, given applications to do ID cards, pictures taken so that they would have some kind of identification, made sure that we made phone calls to the families so they could pick them up. If they didn't have families, we were getting them into lodging that night. Transportation, everything worked flawlessly. And what we did is we built the capacity of the government of Haiti so that when our program ended and it was phasing out as I was leaving, that they could handle that entire process and reintegrating them slowly on their own with the limited resources they had. And they had gotten there, and their attitudes had completely shifted from seeing these people as criminals to seeing them as human beings. And that, in a country where so much doesn't function, to see that kind of success. And our team, we worked a lot with Department of Homeland Security, and we got awards for this. We got accolades from all the way up to the White House. It was just amazing to see, and I was really proud that we could get so much done in a limited amount of time in a country where a lot of people say, you can't get much done at all.
Sure.
And I've checked in, and that program's still going, so.
That's fantastic. Sustainability, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
What about the opposite side of the coin? Has there been a time when you've been managing a project now in Jamaica or in Haiti or Zimbabwe or Ghana, northern Uganda, you said, where you felt like you just gave it your all and it fell flat on its face?
Do I want to admit that, though? Honestly.
Well, the second part to that is, how do you learn from that? And
right.
What do you take from it in order to do better the next time?
I'm not going to speak to my present employer, but the Red Cross, when I worked for them, and again, it was just it was a 6-month consultancy, but the American Red Cross had gone through some of their own internal challenges and bad leadership and so forth. And so I came on when they were going through a really serious rift. And they laid off about a third of my first week on their job. They announced they were laying off about a third of their staff.
That's always a great way to start a job.
Yeah, and I had been put on disaster preparedness for pandemic flu at the time, bird flu, which was all the crisis in the U.S., that it was coming and it was going to be like the Black Plague. And so I worked on that with literally no support, no leadership, no one even in my office, because I think my supervisor had been laid off on something that really they had gotten funding for, but I still don't see how that was a huge issue in the U.S. I don't think bird flu ever really hit us. And so that to me really felt like a waste of 6 months, and I wasn't really sure about the deliverables of the project and, who I was supposed to be helping and where I was supposed to get resources from. And, it's unfortunate when large respected organizations like that can tend to crumble from within inside and resources are wasted and people are showing up, but they're not doing anything. And the morale was so low, Mm-hmm. So in many ways, I would say that project of mine flopped, whether it was because there wasn't really a need for it or there was no support and leadership behind it. It's hard to say, but luckily it was short-lived.
My last question is one that I ask everybody that we interview here in terms of reference. And I think maybe you'll have a unique perspective because you've had, again, this arc from quite literally, the volunteer in the field, volunteer teacher, all the way up now to one of the pinnacle organizations in development. What's advice that you'd give to somebody who's coming out of a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree, or somebody who's interested in changing their career to become an aid worker or humanitarian or a development worker? What are the core pieces of advice that you'd give them to be successful in this kind of career?
Stephen, I get this question all the time because when I finished my master's and moved to DC, I didn't know anyone. And so many people helped me to get where I was today. And so I always told myself, if anyone asks for an informational interview, I will never turn them down. And I must have done 30, 40, 50 while I was in DC once I was established and still do them on the phone and when I go back. And I always get that question. And, it's really tough. You have to, the biggest thing, if you really want to work in development and you don't know anyone, DC is the city to be in because that is really where the heart of so much is going on with, as far as USAID, World Bank, IMF, many of the Beltway bandits as they're called, but the implementers, the for-profits. And that's your kind of foot in the door. The other way to do it is to actually move to a country, which is much more scary, and just go to an NGO that's on the ground, an international NGO, and say, I'm here, because you'll get hired a lot easier if you're on the ground. If you're in DC, I was told again and again, just network, do informational interviews, meet as many people you can, take people out for drinks, because you'll never know. And this is what happened to me on my job for OTI. Someone I had done an informational interview with and taken out for a drink was on my interview panel. And that's part of the reason I got the job, because they knew me and they knew my background. And literally they'll get hundreds of resumes, and it's that one thing that makes you stand out. The other advice as I had been given is try and find what companies temp for the big Red Cross, World Bank, USAID, and get in the door that way. Internships are one of the best things. I ended up doing my internship with the UN, which I didn't in the end want to work for. But a lot of people who do them with the company, they really research and know what they want to do, and they do it with that company. That is their best way, and they will most likely be hired. And sometimes you're not going to get paid, or you're not going to get paid a lot, but it's worth putting in the time because it's an extremely competitive field. Everybody has master's degrees. Everyone's done Peace Corps. Everyone speaks 3-4 languages. It really comes down to who you know and what your field work experience has been. And in many ways, having more experience in the field and abroad speaks louder to an employee than what your degrees are and where you went to school. So if you can get that under your belt, Peace Corps is a great way to get started, doing internships abroad, But a lot of people want to go into this field. It's exciting. It's, dynamic. You're learning new cultures. You're getting abroad, and it's really competitive. So, I probably struggled for a year and a half. I must have done 14 interviews. I probably applied to 3 times as many jobs, and I put in the time, and eventually it'll pay off.
Nichole, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Stephen.
You've been listening to Terms of Reference, a weekly podcast from aidpreneur.com. Find us on iTunes or at www.aidpreneur.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.